I was 31 when I decided to camp alone in the high desert foothills of northern Nevada in late October of 2019. I had taken solo trips before, but never in that part of the state. It was a dry, open place with sagebrush stretching far in every direction, broken only by low rocky ridges and long, empty dirt roads that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. I wanted space, silence, and a break from everything back home. I wasn't searching for anything dramatic. I just wanted a quiet weekend. Before I left, an older man at a fuel station had mentioned that people in the area joked about shape-shifting creatures, the kind of stories locals say mostly to mess with outsiders. I didn't take any of it seriously. I had heard similar things in many rural towns, old legends people keep alive for entertainment or to scare visiting hikers. I drove away thinking nothing of it, but the memory of his words stayed somewhere in the back of my mind, even though I didn't believe in anything supernatural. The drive to my chosen spot took longer than I expected. The dirt road grew rougher mile by mile, and the clouds overhead took on a heavy gray look. It wasn't supposed to rain, but the sky didn't care about the forecast. By the time I reached the pull-off near the base of a low ridge, the entire area felt swallowed by a stillness so complete that even the small sounds of my truck settling after the engine shut off seemed unnaturally loud. I set up my tent on a patch of level ground. The air smelled of cold earth and dry brush. There were small animal prints around, coyote tracks probably, and a few larger ones from deer. Nothing unusual. What did feel unusual was how isolated the place felt. I had camped alone many times in remote areas, but something about this spot made the back of my neck tighten. It wasn't fear, just a kind of alertness that I couldn't explain at the time. After setting up, I walked around the ridge as the sun dropped behind a spread of jagged clouds. The temperature fell fast, and the wind made a faint moaning sound as it brushed through the dry shrubs. I kept noticing the silence between gusts. It didn't sound like normal quiet. It felt like the land was waiting. For what? I didn't know. I told myself I was just tired from the drive. Back at camp, I cooked a quick meal, packed my leftovers in a sealed bag, and hung it a bit away from my tent just in case an animal wandered near. The sky turned dark faster than it usually does in summer, and the desert night wrapped around everything in a heavy, almost suffocating blackness. No moon, no stars, just shadows that seemed to shift whenever my headlamp moved. I got into my tent, zipped it closed, and lay down on my sleeping bag. The wind pushed at the tent walls now and then, and I listened to the distant rustle of brush. It was peaceful for a while. Then something changed. It started with the sound of shuffling steps on dry ground. They were slow, uneven, and too heavy to be a rabbit or small critter. They weren't the fast, light steps of a coyote either. They had weight. They paused, then continued, then paused again. My heart began to beat harder even though I told myself it could be a deer. Still, deer usually move in pairs or groups, and they don't creep like that. The steps circled the tent from several feet away, not close enough to touch the fabric, but close enough that I could hear the subtle drag of something brushing the dirt. I didn't move. My breath felt loud inside my chest even though I tried to keep it shallow. After a minute, the steps stopped. The silence that followed made my skin crawl more than the footsteps did. I waited, counting slowly in my head, trying to decide if I should sit up or stay down. I didn't hear anything else for a long moment, and I eventually managed to relax enough to shut my eyes. Then I heard something else, something that didn't match any animal sound I knew. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't a growl. It was more like the soft, strained breathing of someone trying not to be heard. It came from just outside, near where the front of my tent faced. I stayed frozen. Every muscle in my body tightened. I had no weapon, only a heavy flashlight, a pocket knife, and a can of bear spray tucked inside my pack. I didn't reach for anything because the sound stopped as suddenly as it started. Eventually, Exhaustion forced my body to sleep in short, shallow bursts. I woke again around what I guessed was 3 a.m. The wind had died completely, and the tent felt strangely warm. Too warm. I pushed the fabric near my head to let some air circulate, and that was when I realized the warm feeling wasn't from the tent. Someone or something had been near the tent again, close enough that I could sense body heat through the thin layer of fabric. It lingered in the air, fading slowly. I stayed awake until the first faint blue light of dawn crept over the ridge. As soon as I had enough visibility, I unzipped the tent and stepped out. The morning air was cold again, which confirmed that the warmth I felt earlier had not been the environment. Around the tent, the ground was disturbed. There were footprints, but they weren't clear enough to identify. They looked somewhat human but wider in the front and oddly angled, like the person wasn't walking normally. There were also shorter, lighter prints that looked more like an animal's. At first, I thought it must have been two separate things, but the prints overlapped too cleanly, switching shapes partway through. It didn't make sense. I told myself the dirt was uneven, and my imagination was running wild from lack of sleep. I packed up quickly. I didn't want to spend another minute out there. I shoved gear into the truck bed without caring about the order. While loading, I noticed something else. The bag of leftover food I had hung from a branch had been taken down and placed neatly on a flat rock. Not torn open, not dragged away, just placed there. The knot hadn't been ripped. It had been untied. Animals don't do that. I got in my truck and started driving back toward the nearest paved road. It was a long drive, nearly an hour of nothing but dirt tracks and scattered brush. For most of the ride, I kept checking the rearview mirror. Part of me felt embarrassed, but another part of me felt as if I wasn't alone. About 15 minutes into the drive, I spotted something to the right, a figure standing still between two big sagebrush bushes. At first, I thought it was a deer or maybe a tall coyote standing strangely on its hind legs. But when I looked again, it seemed too much like a human silhouette. Not moving, not stepping forward, just watching. I kept driving, refusing to slow down. My hands tightened on the wheel every time the truck hit a bump. When I finally reached the paved road and cell service returned, I pulled over and sat there for a long time with the engine running. My heart wouldn't slow down. My breathing felt sharp and unsteady. I kept seeing the prints in the dirt, the tied food bag, and that shape standing in the brush. I didn't report anything to the authorities. I didn't tell anyone for months. I knew how it would sound. A grown adult claiming something strange had stalked them in the desert. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized the truth wasn't supernatural. There was nothing magical about what happened. It was frightening because it was real. Someone had been out there with me. Someone who moved quietly at night, who watched my camp, and who knew how to approach without being seen. People disappear in remote places every year. Some leave no trace at all. After that trip, I understood how easily it could happen. The desert hides people better than any legend. Whatever or whoever was out there that night was not a creature out of old stories. It was a person, someone skilled, someone patient, someone who knew those lands better than I did. I never went back to that part of Nevada again. I still camp sometimes, but never alone, and never far from places where other people can hear if something goes wrong. When I think about that night, the part that stays with me the most isn't the footsteps or the breathing or the shape in the brush. It's the simple fact that whoever followed me didn't try to harm me right away. They watched, they waited, they walked around my tent slowly in the dark hours when most animals rest. The legends people joke about aren't frightening. What's frightening is the idea that a real person, hiding behind those legends, might use them as cover to stalk anyone unlucky enough to camp in the wrong part of the desert. That night taught me a lesson I will carry for the rest of my life. The scariest thing in the wilderness is always the human you don't see until it's too late. I still remember the way the air felt on that late September night in 2016, somewhere deep in the northern woods of Alberta. I had driven out on my own, thinking a quiet weekend alone would help me reset after months of stress. I was 28 at the time, old enough to know better than to camp alone so far from other people, but I didn't care. I wanted silence. I wanted trees, cold air, and the feeling of being away from everything. I parked my old gray SUV at the edge of a narrow dirt road, a place I had found only after hours of driving past endless fields, broken fences, and abandoned barns. The sky had been bright when I arrived, a pale blue that made the pine trees look almost black. I walked a few hundred meters into the forest with my pack on my shoulders and picked a flat spot between two thick trees. The ground was covered in soft moss and dry needles, and the air smelled like sap and cold earth. I set up my small green tent, spread out my sleeping bag, and gathered some fallen branches for a fire. Everything felt calm and harmless. I could hear only the faint rustle of leaves and some distant bird calls. By the time the sun began to drop behind the tree line, I had a small fire going. The heat felt good against my cold hands. I roasted a simple meal, sat on a fallen log, and watched the smoke drift through the branches. There was something comforting about the quiet, almost like the forest was letting me borrow its peace for a while. I stayed like that for a long time, thinking about nothing, letting my mind settle. But as the sky darkened into a muddy gray, the wind picked up. It wasn't a soft breeze. It came fast, sharp, and cold, sliding through the trees hard enough to make them creak. I tightened my jacket around my chest and fed the fire more wood, but it didn't help much. The temperature dropped quickly, faster than I expected. The wind kept pushing smoke into my face, burning my eyes, so I decided to call it early and crawl into my tent. Inside, the air was slightly warmer. I kept a small battery lantern near my feet and slipped into my sleeping bag. For a while, I just lay there listening to the wind move through the branches. It was a constant low howl mixed with short whistles when it found narrow spaces between the trees. It wasn't scary at first, just annoying. But after an hour or so, the wind shifted and the sound started to change. I began hearing something heavier, not like wind at all. It sounded like movement, slow movement, the kind that made the ground respond in a faint, dull way. I tried to tell myself it was just branches falling or maybe a deer moving somewhere near my campsite. That made sense. Animals walked through forests all the time. Still, the noise made me freeze for a few seconds, my breathing slow and quiet. I tried to ignore it and shut my eyes. Just as I started to drift towards sleep, I heard something sharper, like a thin snap of a broken twig, but close, too close. My eyes opened immediately. The noise hadn't come from far away. It sounded like it was just a few meters from my tent. I held my breath and listened. At first, there was nothing, only the wind again. Then something brushed lightly against the outside of the tent, like a hand sliding over fabric. My whole body tensed. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe for a moment. My mind ran through every logical explanation I could think of. Maybe it was a branch being blown around, hitting the tent. But the motion had felt too smooth, too controlled. Not random. I stayed still, waiting for the next sound. A few seconds later, I heard soft, uneven footsteps. They were slow, dragging slightly, crushing needles and small twigs under them. They circled from one side of the tent to the back. I could picture a shape moving around me, just outside the thin wall of fabric that was the only thing between me and open air. I couldn't see anything because I had turned my lantern off earlier to save battery, but I felt the weight of the dark pressing against the tent walls. The steps stopped directly behind me. I could feel the heat of my own breath trapped inside the sleeping bag, hear my heartbeat thumping too loud in my ears. My mind started racing through all the things I had read about people stumbling across bears or cougars at night, and how staying completely still sometimes helped. But the footsteps hadn't sounded like an animal. They were too controlled, too human. I waited in absolute stillness for what felt like forever. The forest outside had gone quiet. Even the wind seemed to stop for a moment, leaving only a deep, heavy silence. Then, without warning, something pressed against the back wall of my tent, firm enough to bend the fabric inward. Felt like a hand, a human hand, pushing slowly. Not a paw, not an animal, a hand. I felt a wave of cold travel from my spine to my fingertips. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I tried to stay silent, but it felt like the tent was shrinking around me. Whoever or whatever was outside stayed there for several long seconds. Then the pressure vanished. The steps began again, slow, dragging, moving away this time. I waited until I could no longer hear anything but the wind again. Even then, I didn't move. I stayed frozen inside my sleeping bag, staring at the dark ceiling of the tent, trying to control my breathing. I wasn't sure if the person had left or was just standing somewhere beyond my range of hearing. The thought made my stomach twist. I forced myself to stay awake for hours, listening to every small sound outside. At some point, exhaustion pulled me under despite the fear. I didn't mean to fall asleep, but my body gave in. When I woke up, the sky outside was a pale, early morning gray. The forest felt different in daylight, less alive, more still. I slowly unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The air was cold and crisp. Everything looked normal from a distance. But when I walked around the tent, I saw them. Footprints. Not clear ones, since the ground was covered in needles and soft dirt, but enough to make out the shape of shoes. Long, narrow shoe prints circling my tent. They stopped right where I had felt the pressure on the fabric. The prints were so close that whoever made them must have been kneeling or bending near the wall. I felt sick as I followed the prints toward the tree line. They moved straight into the woods and disappeared between two thick trunks. I looked around at the forest, every direction full of dark shapes and shadows. Someone had been there during the night. Someone had watched me. Someone had touched the tent. I had camped alone countless times before, but nothing like that had ever happened. My hands shook as I packed my gear. I didn't take a break, didn't eat, didn't let myself stop to think. I just stuffed everything into my pack and hurried back to my SUV. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing among the trees watching me leave. But the forest stayed silent. When I finally reached the car and slammed the door shut, I felt some of the fear ease. Not all of it, just enough to breathe normally again. I started the engine, turned around on the narrow dirt road, and drove until the forest opened into flat land and the sunlight felt warm again. I didn't report anything. I didn't tell anyone at first because I knew how it would sound. Just footprints and noises in the dark. No proof. But I knew what I felt that night. I knew that someone had been out there, walking around my tent, studying me through the thin fabric, maybe deciding whether to do more than just watch. That trip changed the way I see silence. I used to think it meant peace. Now, whenever I go camping, even with friends, I always listen deeper when the forest goes quiet. I always check the ground for signs. I never sleep without something heavy near my hand, and I never go anywhere that isolated again. The memory of that night has stayed with me, clear as the cold air that surrounded my tent, clear as the slow crunch of footsteps circling me in the dark. I don't know who it was or what they wanted, but I know one thing with absolute certainty. They were human, and that is what makes it so much worse. I went camping on a farm in southern Iowa in the late summer of 2019, when I was 26 and trying to take a short break from work. I had been feeling worn out from city noise and wanted quiet, open space, and a few nights alone. I rented a small camping spot on a private farm outside a town called Ridge Hill. The farm was big, almost too big, stretching over fields that seemed to run forever with nothing but dry cornstalks and faint tree lines in the distance. The owner had a small map posted by the entrance showing where campers were allowed, but I didn't see any other cars when I drove in, so I knew I would be alone out there. The air felt dry and warm, and the wind kept pushing tall grass in long, slow waves. The gravel road leading to the camping spot shook my car until my teeth felt like they clicked together. I kept going deeper, past a broken barn that looked like it had not been used for years, and past a rusted tractor with weeds growing through its wheels. I finally reached a flat patch of land bordered by an empty field and a long fence made of old wooden posts. Beyond the fence was another part of the property, wide and silent. I set up my tent slowly, trying to enjoy the quiet. It was the kind of quiet that felt heavy, the kind you notice after living around traffic and constant city noise. I made a small fire ring with the rocks stacked near the campsite, heated a can of food, and watched the sky darken into a strong orange before turning into a deep blue. Fireflies blinked in the tall grass. Everything felt peaceful. But even then, before anything strange happened, I felt like the space around me had too much room in it, like the emptiness was pressing on me from all sides. When it got fully dark, I walked a few meters from my tent and looked across the open field. There were no lights anywhere, no houses, no roads in sight. Just the wide black crop rose stretching into the distance. I could hear insects buzzing and something small moving in the grass. That was normal, I told myself. Farms are full of animals, even at night. I tried not to overthink it. I crawled into my tent around 10. The air was warm but cooling fast, so I left the zipper slightly open to let a bit of fresh air in. I lay there listening to the soft wind brushing across the field. I must have been half asleep when I heard a faint crunch from far away. It sounded like something stepping on dry soil. At first I thought it was a deer or maybe a stray dog, but the sound didn't move in a natural way. It wasn't random or quiet. It came in slow, steady steps, one at a time, long pauses between them, almost like someone walking slowly through the field. I stayed still, listening. The steps stopped. The night went quiet again, except for the insects. I told myself it must have been an animal, and eventually I drifted off. I woke up sometime after midnight because I felt a strong smell, an old, earthy smell, like wet hay mixed with metal and something sour. It wasn't normal. It wasn't the smell of soil or smoke or grass. It smelled like something that had been sealed away and opened again after too long. I sat up in my sleeping bag and listened. The smell grew stronger, like it was drifting inside the tent. The wind outside had stopped completely. There was no movement, no sound. I couldn't even hear insects anymore. It felt like everything outside had frozen. Then I heard something brushing against the side of the tent. It was soft at first, almost like a sleeve of fabric or a piece of rope dragging gently across the nylon. But then something heavier touched the tent, pressing the material inward for a second before lifting away. I stared at the thin wall of fabric beside me, waiting for the pressure to return. Didn't. Instead, I heard slow footsteps move away toward the field. I didn't sleep again that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone standing right outside, staring at the tent, waiting. I sat upright until the faint blue of morning finally came. When daylight returned, I stepped outside and looked around the tent. The grass was flattened near the left side. Not a lot, but enough to show something had stood there. I checked the field and saw nothing but the same long rows stretching away. The air felt normal again. Birds were calling from somewhere far off, which made me feel a little better. I convinced myself it had to be a stray cow or maybe a farm worker who didn't know I was camping there. But something about the way the grass was pressed down didn't look like the shape of an animal. It looked more like 2 feet had stood side by side. Even then, I tried to shake it off. I spent the day walking around the edge of the fields, taking pictures of old machinery and fence posts covered in peeling paint. The farm had a strange charm when the sun was out. It felt old and forgotten, but calm. I saw no one the entire day, not even the farm owner. When evening came again, the air felt different. The wind that had blown all afternoon died out suddenly, leaving everything still. I didn't like how quickly the stillness settled in. It felt like the moment before a storm, except there were no clouds, no change in temperature, nothing to warn me of weather. Just silence settling over the land like a heavy blanket. I built another fire and watched the flames twist. I kept looking over my shoulder toward the fence line, the field, the old broken barn far in the distance. I kept expecting to see movement there, but nothing happened. Still, I felt watched. Not in a dramatic way, just in that creeping, cold way you feel when you know there's something close but you can't see it. I decided to go to bed early just to get the night over with, but I didn't fall asleep. I lay there staring at the faint glow of the dying fire outside the thin tent wall. Around midnight, the smell returned. That same sour, metallic old smell. It slipped into the air so slowly that at first I thought I imagined it. But it grew stronger, stronger than the night before. Then the brushing sound came again. Something dragged along the side of the tent, slow and almost careful. It moved around the back of the tent, stopping behind my head. I stopped breathing. I felt a faint shift in the air, like something tall was leaning over the tent. Then I heard breathing, not loud, not aggressive, just slow, steady breaths, like someone standing inches from the thin wall between us. The breathing lasted maybe 10 seconds, but it felt like minutes. Then the steps moved away again, slow and wandering, heading toward the old field. I didn't wait until morning. I packed everything as fast as I could, shoving my sleeping bag into the car and tearing the stakes out of the ground. I didn't fold anything. I didn't check anything. I simply grabbed and threw everything into the back seat. When I finally started the car, my hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped the keys. As I drove down the gravel road, I looked once into the field. The fireflies were gone. The wind wasn't moving the grass. Everything looked frozen. But in the distance, near the middle of the field where the crop rows began, I saw a figure. Not moving, not walking, just standing there, tall and still, facing my direction. I kept driving without slowing down. When I returned home the next day, I checked the farm's listing again out of curiosity. The listing had been removed. The owner's name was gone. The entire page was wiped clean as if it never existed. I tried searching for the farm on a map and found that most of the land had been sold years ago and marked as restricted property due to unsafe structures. I don't know who or what was out there those 2 nights, but I know it was a person, a living person, someone who watched me from the fields, someone who walked right up to my tent and stood only inches from my head. The smell, the slow steps, the careful movement around the tent, it was all too deliberate. I haven't gone camping alone since, and when I drive past wide open farmland now, even in daylight, I always look twice at the empty rows. Not because I expect to see something there, but because I know someone could be standing in the crops, completely still, watching, waiting for night to come. And the worst part is knowing that if I hadn't left when I did, that silent figure in the field might not have stayed in the field. It might have come closer. It might have waited outside the tent again, or maybe this time it wouldn't have stopped at the tent wall. That thought alone is enough to keep me from ever sleeping on a farm again. I was 29 that summer, and I had been feeling tired of the noise of the city and the dull routine I had fallen into. Work felt heavy, the days felt short, and everything around me seemed loud and crowded. So I decided to take a short camping trip by myself. I picked a quiet area in northern Norway in late August of 2021, far from the usual tourist spots, where there were open fields, tall pine trees, and long dirt tracks almost nobody used anymore. The plan was to spend 2 nights there, rest a little, and come back home feeling lighter. I packed food, a small tent, a cooking stove, warm clothes, and a notebook. I wanted peace, silence, and space to breathe. The drive out was peaceful. The roads were empty, and the air felt cleaner as I left the towns behind. By the time I reached the gravel track leading to the open field where I wanted to camp, the sky was already turning light orange. I parked my car beside a patch of trees, walked around to make sure the ground was level enough, and set up my tent facing a small hill. Everything around me was still. The air had that strong smell of cold soil and old wood. I could hear only the faint sound of wind moving through the pines. I remember thinking that I had made the right choice. Everything felt safe and open. After setting everything up, I ate a quick meal and walked a little farther into the trees just to look around. There were old tire marks on the ground, but they looked faded and broken by grass, as if no vehicle had used that track in months. I found a stream a little deeper in, running quietly over stones covered in moss. The quietness made my own movements sound louder than usual. Every step felt like it echoed through the trees. Night came slowly. The temperature dropped fast, and soon the sky became a dark blue bowl full of stars. I crawled into my tent and wrapped myself in my sleeping bag. I could still hear the wind outside, but it became softer after a while. I fell asleep easily because I felt comfortable. I woke up around 3 in the morning, not because of a noise, but because of a strange tight feeling in my stomach, like a quiet worry without a reason. At first I tried to ignore it and go back to sleep, but my body wouldn't calm down. I lay still, listening. At first, all I heard was the soft rustling of leaves outside. Then, after maybe a minute or two, I heard something else. A dull crack of a branch coming from somewhere behind my tent. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. I remember freezing instantly, holding my breath, trying to figure out if I had imagined it. Then another crack, a little closer. I waited. The wind couldn't make that sound because it wasn't strong enough. And the trees near my tent weren't the kind that snapped easily from light movement. I tried to tell myself it was maybe a small animal like a fox or a deer. The region had plenty of wildlife. Should not have scared me, but something about the slow, heavy way the branches sounded made me feel more alert than I expected. I stayed in my sleeping bag without moving, listening harder. The noise stopped for a long minute. Then I heard something else, the soft crunch of dry grass being stepped on. The steps were slow, steady, and spaced out like something careful was moving. It did not sound like a running animal. It sounded more like something walking on 2 legs, not 4. My skin went cold immediately. I didn't open the tent because I didn't want any noise to give away that I was awake. I simply stayed still and listened. The steps moved closer to the left side of the tent, then stopped. The silence that followed felt heavy and stretched. I could hear my own heart beating so loudly inside my chest that I wondered if it could be heard outside. Then I heard breathing. Not fast, not loud, just a slow, steady breath from outside the thin fabric of the tent. It was so close that I could almost feel the air shift. I didn't move a muscle. My mind raced with thoughts of who could be out here in the dark at this hour. There were no houses nearby, no campsites, no reason for a person to be walking around in the middle of the night. And the walk to this place wasn't easy unless someone knew the area well. I stayed frozen like that for what felt like 10 minutes, though it could have been less. The breathing stayed in the same spot. Then it slowly moved toward the front of the tent, very slowly, step by step. I could hear the faint shift of the zipper flap brushing against itself as something lightly touched it from the outside. The whole tent trembled just a little, so slightly that if I had been half asleep, I might have missed it. But I was wide awake, listening to every inch of pressure on the fabric. Then, just as quietly as it had come, the breathing drifted away. The steps moved back across the grass, toward the darker part of the trees. one slow step at a time. The sound got softer until it faded completely. I waited what felt like an hour before I dared to move. When the sky finally started turning from black to gray, I crawled out of the tent, my hands shaking. The cold air hit my face, and the field looked exactly the same as before, calm and empty. But the ground around my tent was different. There were clear footprints pressed into the damp soil, larger than mine, spaced evenly apart as if someone had been slowly pacing. Some prints stopped directly in front of my tent's entrance. Others circled the side and then headed back toward the trees. None of them looked like animal tracks. I packed everything fast, faster than I thought I could. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I kept glancing toward the trees, half expecting someone to step out. The whole time, the area stayed silent. Too silent. When I finally locked my car doors and started the engine, I felt my whole body relax slightly, but the fear stayed heavy. I drove away without looking in the mirror. On the road back to town, I kept trying to make sense of what had happened. I tried to think of any explanation that wasn't terrifying. Maybe a hiker had gotten lost. Maybe someone lived deeper in the forest. Maybe someone else had camped nearby without me noticing. But none of those ideas made sense. The way the footsteps moved, the slow pacing around the tent, the breathing right outside the thin fabric, none of it felt like a lost or harmless person. It felt like someone who already knew I was there and came close on purpose. When I reached the town, I parked outside a small store and just sat in the car, breathing slowly, letting my heart settle. I looked at my tent bag in the back seat and thought about how thin the fabric had been, how easily someone could have opened it. For the first time in years, the idea of camping alone felt wrong. Not because nature was dangerous, but because people could be. I went home that afternoon and unpacked everything. I cleaned the tent and folded it, but I didn't put it back in its usual place. I pushed it into the back of the closet behind an old box and closed the door. The whole apartment felt strange to me for a while, as if I had brought the fear back with me. Over the next few days, I slept badly. Every small sound made me alert. Whenever I closed my eyes, I kept remembering the slow steps, the steady breathing just outside the thin wall of fabric. I kept seeing those prints in the damp soil. I kept imagining someone standing only inches away from my face in the dark. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't want people telling me it was probably nothing or calling me dramatic. It didn't feel like nothing. It felt real and close. Weeks passed before I felt normal again, but something inside me changed. I still go hiking now and then, but I have never camped alone again. I don't think I ever will. That night taught me that some places feel quiet not because they are empty, but because something is already there, watching, waiting, moving in ways you don't notice until you're alone in the dark. And the worst part is knowing I will never find out who was outside my tent that night, or what they wanted, or how long they had been watching my campsite before I woke up. The only thing I know for sure is that they were real, they were close, and they left before the sun rose. Not because they were scared, but because they wanted to. That thought has stayed with me more clearly than anything else. It was the summer of 2019, and I had decided to escape the crowded streets of Chicago for a few days of camping in northern Wisconsin. I was 25 at the time, and the stress of work had been gnawing at me for months. I had my old, beat-up Subaru packed with the essentials: a green canvas tent, sleeping bag, camping stove, a few canned foods, and enough water for 3 days. I wanted a place where I could be alone, where the silence was absolute, and the only interruptions were the wind, the rain, or maybe an occasional bird. After a 5-hour drive, I pulled off a small gravel road that led deep into a pine forest. The GPS signal was spotty at best, but I wasn't concerned. I had a paper map folded in my pocket and a general sense of direction. I found a clearing about half a mile from the main road, just big enough for my tent and a small fire ring, and I parked the car nearby. The sun was just beginning to dip behind the dense tree line, casting long shadows that made the forest feel thicker and darker than it probably was. I started unpacking as the first drops of rain began to fall. By the time I had pitched the tent, the rain was steady, soaking the pine needles and making the forest floor slippery. I built a small fire under a makeshift canopy of a tarp, just enough to keep the rain off the flames. The smell of wet pine filled the air, and the rain drummed a constant rhythm on the tent roof. I told myself it was peaceful, calming even, but there was a part of me that noticed the way the forest seemed to shift with the rain, how shadows moved in ways that weren't caused by the wind. I ate a simple dinner, canned beans and a piece of bread I toasted over the fire. As darkness fell, the forest became almost suffocating. I kept the fire alive as long as I could, but eventually, the rain forced me to retreat into the tent. I unrolled my sleeping bag, zipped it up tightly, and lay on my back, listening. That's when I first heard it, a faint, scraping noise, like something dragging across wet branches. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a branch falling, maybe an animal. Wisconsin forests are full of deer, raccoons, and stray dogs. But then the sound moved closer, and the rhythm didn't match the way branches fall naturally. It was deliberate, slow, careful, and unsettlingly quiet. I unzipped the tent slightly to peek outside. The rain had blurred my vision, making everything appear as shadowy shapes. I could barely make out the outline of a figure standing between the trees. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks. The rain made the forest look like a moving painting, shapes and shadows constantly shifting. But the scraping sound came again, this time closer, and I could see movement. A person, tall and hunched over, carrying something long in their hands. I froze. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst through my chest. I told myself to stay calm. Maybe they were a hunter. The area was known for hunting, and it was prime season. Still, there was no sound of a hunting rifle, no voice calling out. Just the scraping, careful steps. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the figure. The light cut through the rain like a knife, and the figure vanished instantly. My stomach dropped. There was no way they could have moved that fast without slipping in the mud. I sat up, straining my ears. The rain was louder than ever, hammering the tent and the tarp, but beneath it, I could hear it. The wet crunch of footsteps circling my campsite. My mind was racing. I had my phone, but there was no signal. I had my car keys. Maybe I could make a run for the car if things got worse. But the clearing was small, and the forest around me was dense. Running blindly in the dark could be just as dangerous. The hours crawled by. The rain never let up. Every few minutes, I would hear a branch snap just beyond the tree line, or the scrape of something dragging along the ground. Couldn't sleep. I couldn't even breathe normally without hearing some new noise. I kept my flashlight by my side, the beam slicing through the tent walls whenever the scraping got closer. I realized the figure wasn't moving randomly. It was methodically circling the campsite, always staying just out of clear view. By around 2:30 a.m., the figure made its biggest mistake. I was staring at the edge of the clearing, trying not to breathe too loudly, when a sharp snap echoed through the rain. The person, or whatever it was, had stepped on a fallen branch. I saw movement, a shadow shifting closer to my car. Panic took over. I grabbed my jacket, my shoes, and my flashlight, and I ran. The mud sucked at my boots. The rain soaked me to the bone. But I didn't stop until I reached the Subaru. I fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling, but finally got the door open. I threw myself inside, locked the doors, and slammed my foot on the accelerator. Tires skidded in the mud, spraying water everywhere, but I didn't care. I drove through the forest, headlights cutting a narrow path through the trees, until I found the main gravel road. I didn't stop until I reached a small town about 20 miles away. There was a 24-hour gas station, and I pulled in, dripping wet, shivering, and exhausted. I didn't even think about calling anyone until I was sitting on a bench, drying off with a store napkin. My mind kept replaying the campsite, the shadowy figure, the way it moved, the deliberate circling. The next day, I went back with a few friends and looked at the campsite. The clearing looked normal in the daylight, but I noticed a few things that hadn't been clear in the dark. Deep footprints in the mud, large enough to belong to a man, and the scrape marks on the trees, likely from something long being dragged along them. Nothing else seemed taken, nothing disturbed except the mud and the broken branches. I never went back to that part of the forest at night again. I kept camping in Wisconsin, but always in designated areas, never alone, never in dense forests away from roads. I never knew exactly who or what had been watching me that night. Maybe a hunter, maybe someone living illegally in the woods, maybe a criminal. I never found out. But that rainy night taught me that the forest, no matter how peaceful it seems, can hold dangers you can't predict, and that silence is not always empty. Even now, years later, I can still feel that cold, damp fear creeping up my spine whenever I hear a heavy rain outside. I remember the smell of wet pine, the rhythm of rain on the tent, and the way shadows seem to move with a life of their own. That night could have ended much worse. I got out alive, soaked and scared, but alive, and I never forgot the lesson. In the wilderness, the most terrifying things aren't supernatural, they're human. I still think about the night I camped alone in northern Arizona back in 2016, long before I understood how quickly a quiet place can turn into something dangerous. I was 24 then, restless, tired of my small apartment in Phoenix, and always chasing the idea of some quiet outdoor escape. I had done plenty of camping trips before, but most of them were on crowded sites where the air felt full of other people's noise. That weekend, I wanted silence. I wanted to hear myself think. I chose a spot about 20 miles away from the edges of Coconino National Forest, not too deep into the woods, but far enough from any road that I could feel alone. I reached the area in the late afternoon. The sky was pale blue, clear, wide, and it felt like I had all the space in the world. The air smelled of pine sap and cold dirt, and the wind was soft enough that I could hear leaves brushing lightly against each other. I parked my car beside a cluster of thin trees and walked farther in until I found a flat, open patch. The ground there looked solid and dry, covered with fallen needles and small rocks. I set up my old green tent, the one with a broken zipper on the inside pocket, and spread my sleeping bag and backpack inside. After that, I gathered some branches and dead wood to build a small fire. The sun dipped low, turning orange around the edges as I set everything up. I cooked a simple meal on a tiny aluminum stove, the kind that folds into itself. The smell of heated canned food filled the air, mixing with the scent of burning wood. I ate slowly, letting the heat warm my hands as the temperature dropped around me. When darkness finally settled in, the fire became the only bright point in the entire forest. It cracked softly, pushing back the shadows just enough for me to feel comfortable. I remember staring into the flames, letting my mind wander. Everything felt calm. I could hear crickets. I could hear the faint movement of the wind in the branches. I could even hear the occasional creak of a distant tree bending under its own weight. I thought that quiet was what I came for, but after a while the silence grew too deep. Fire noise and insect sounds were normal, but everything else around me felt too still, too empty. I tried to ignore the feeling, brushed some dirt off my boots, and tried to relax. It wasn't until I was closing the fire pit that I heard the first sound that didn't belong. It came from behind the tree line to the west, sharp, sudden, like a branch snapping under something heavier than a deer. I froze, waiting for another sound, but the forest returned to its normal rhythm. I told myself it was nothing, an animal maybe, a strong gust of wind, something normal. I put out the fire by covering the glowing wood with dirt, making sure no smoke rose from it. I hated the idea of accidentally starting a wildfire. Then I crawled into my tent, zipped it shut, and wrapped myself in my sleeping bag. My headlamp cast a soft glow on the tent walls until I switched it off. For a while, I lay there listening to the forest. Every shift of my body made the fabric rustle. Every breath seemed too loud. The night air pressed against the thin walls of the tent, and it felt like the world outside was leaning closer. I kept still, hoping sleep would come quickly. Didn't. An hour must have passed before I heard another sound. Not a crack this time, more like a slow, deliberate step on dry ground. I felt the hairs on my arms rise. My heartbeat picked up fast enough that I could feel pressure in my temples. The steps were not heavy, but they were steady, spaced apart, moving with purpose. I tried to breathe slowly, telling myself it was probably an elk or even a lost cow from some nearby ranch, but the steps stopped too close to my tent. I could sense the presence of something standing just beyond the thin fabric wall. I didn't move. I didn't unzip anything. I lay completely still, barely even breathing. I could hear the soft crunch of dirt as something shifted its weight. Then nothing. Total stillness. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. I waited for the steps to move away, but minutes passed without anything happening. I don't know how long I stayed frozen. Could have been 10 minutes. Could have been an hour. My mind kept trying to picture what stood outside. An animal, a human, something injured, something watching. Eventually the steps moved again, very slowly, as if the person or thing was trying not to make noise. They drifted away to the side of the tent and stopped again. I could hear breathing then, not loud but clearly human. Slow breaths, steady, controlled, not panicked, not tired, as if someone was standing there on purpose, keeping quiet, taking long, careful breaths. I felt cold spread through my entire body. My first thought was that maybe someone had been camping nearby and wandered toward my site in the dark. But no normal person would stand silently beside a stranger's tent in the middle of the night without saying anything. I didn't dare unzip the tent or make any sound. I didn't want whoever it was to know I was awake. I kept thinking about my car, how far it was, how long it would take for me to reach it if I had to run. But running in the dark through uneven ground felt even more dangerous with someone already so close. After what felt like an eternity, the breathing faded and the steps moved farther away until they disappeared completely. I stayed awake for hours after that, listening for any sign of return. My mouth felt dry, my tongue heavy, and my back hurt from lying stiff the whole time, but I didn't dare shift my position. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me into a light, restless sleep. When I woke up, the sun was already rising, and the forest looked normal again. Bright, quiet, harmless. I unzipped the tent, stepped outside, and scanned the area. My heart jumped when I saw the ground. There were footprints in the soft dirt beside the tent. Clear ones, made by boots, not animals. They circled around once before heading back toward the direction of the thicker trees. I followed the trail a few yards into the woods until it faded into mixed pine needles. I didn't want to follow it deeper. Something in me knew I wasn't supposed to. I packed up everything quickly, faster than I ever had on any camping trip before. My hands shook while I loaded the gear into the car. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone watching from the trees. The drive back to the main road felt longer than the drive in. My stomach stayed tight the entire time. When I reached a gas station miles away, I finally let myself breathe normally again. I later learned from a local that sometimes people wander the forest out there. Some are drifters, some are people living off the grid, and some are simply not in the right state of mind. None of that made me feel better. The idea of someone standing inches from me while I tried to sleep still makes my spine go cold. I never saw the person. I never knew why they were there or what they wanted. Nothing dramatic happened, but that made it worse. It was real in the most ordinary human way. Someone chose to stand next to my tent in the dead of night and watch. I stopped camping alone after that. Not because of animals, not because of weather, but because of that moment when I realized the scariest part of the wilderness isn't the darkness or the silence. It's the people who move quietly enough that you don't hear them until they're already standing right beside you. And when you're alone out there, that is more terrifying than anything else. I went camping alone in the late autumn of 2019, a few miles off a remote trail that cut through the North York Moors. I was 31 then, a little too confident in my experience with the outdoors and not honest enough with myself about how quickly isolation could turn uncomfortable. I chose a small patch of flat ground near a thin line of trees, close enough to give some shelter from wind, but far enough from any path that I wouldn't see hikers or dog walkers. At least that was the plan. I wanted silence, clean, cold air, and a break from work that had been grinding me down for months. The first day was calm. The sky stayed gray but dry, and the air had that sharp smell of damp soil and old leaves. I walked around the area for hours, just wandering and trying to push work out of my mind. My phone had no signal, which I expected, so I turned it off and left it in my bag. The only sounds were my boots on soft ground and the distant rustle of wind brushing along the tops of the moorland grass. By the time evening crept in, the temperature dropped fast. I ate a simple meal and sat outside my tent, watching the light fade into a dull blue. There was a peaceful emptiness to the whole landscape, the kind that felt almost too big. No lights, no voices, no proof of other people anywhere around me. I told myself this was exactly what I needed, just stillness. It must have been sometime after midnight when I woke to the feeling that something wasn't right. The cold had crept through the layers of my sleeping bag, but that wasn't what pulled me out of sleep. It was the strange sense that the ground outside my tent had changed. I couldn't explain it at first. It felt like the silence had gotten heavier, as if the air was holding something it shouldn't. I didn't move for several minutes. I just listened. There was no wind anymore, no rustle of grass, no distant animal noises. It was like the whole moor had paused. Slowly, I sat up, my eyes adjusting to the faint darkness inside the tent. I waited for some normal sound to return, something that would convince me that my nerves were playing tricks on me. Then I heard the soft crunch of footsteps. They were slow, spaced unevenly, and far too close for comfort. I held my breath without meaning to. The footsteps weren't on the path and not in the deeper grass either. They were directly near my tent, moving carefully, almost dragging through the leaves and thin twigs scattered on the ground. Whoever it was wasn't trying to be loud, but they weren't trying to hide either. The steps sounded purposeful, like they were circling. I felt the weight of fear settle into my chest. My heartbeat picked up so fast that I could hear it in my ears. My mind scrambled through explanations. A late hiker? A farmer? Someone camping nearby who wandered too far in the dark? But none of those made sense. No one would be walking this deep into the moors at that hour without a light, without a voice, without any sign of normal behavior. I stayed completely still. I didn't reach for my torch. I didn't unzip my sleeping bag. I didn't even swallow. I didn't want the person outside to know I was awake. The footsteps paused right beside the tent. I felt the faintest pressure against the fabric, as if someone had lightly brushed their hand along it. A thin line of cold traveled up my spine. My tent was the only thing between me and whoever stood there. Just a sheet of nylon, nothing that could protect me. The person stood there for a long time. Too long. I counted seconds in my head, got lost, started again. The stillness was worse than the footsteps had been. It made it clear this wasn't an accident or someone wandering by. Whoever it was had stopped on purpose. Eventually, the footsteps resumed, moving around the back of the tent. I could tell by the change in sound when the person stepped onto patches of damp moss or kicked a small stone. Then the steps faded slowly into the trees, becoming softer until I couldn't hear them at all. I didn't sleep again that night. I stayed frozen in place until the faint gray light of morning started to creep through the tent walls. Only then did I dare unzip the flap. The ground outside was disturbed. There were clear boot prints in the soft soil. Large ones, deeper than mine and fresher. They led from the direction of the trees right up to my tent, stopped in several places, then looped back toward the woods. No stray animal tracks, no sign of a second person. Just a single set of prints belonging to the one who stood outside for what felt like forever. I told myself to pack up and leave immediately, but another part of me wanted answers, or maybe I wanted to prove to myself that I hadn't imagined it. I walked toward the trees in the direction the footsteps disappeared. The morning was cold and quiet, but at least the silence felt normal again. When I reached the edge of the trees, I saw something hanging from one of the low branches. At first I thought it was a torn piece of fabric caught by the wind, but when I got closer, I saw it was a strip of thin, frayed rope. It dangled low, swaying slightly even though there was no breeze. Below it, the ground had been disturbed, pressed down into a shallow, uneven circle like someone had been standing there for a long time. I didn't want to touch any of it. I backed away and returned to my campsite. My tent looked smaller and more fragile than ever before. My hands shook as I stuffed everything into my pack. The cold felt harsher than the night before, and every snap of a twig made me flinch. As I hiked out, I kept looking over my shoulder. The landscape that had looked peaceful and empty the day before now felt open in a threatening way, like I was exposed from every angle. Every dark shape in the distance looked like a person. Every patch of trees felt like it was hiding something. I didn't stop walking until I reached a small parking area miles away, where my car sat alone. Even then, I felt watched as I pulled the door shut and locked it. My hands were stiff with cold and fear. When I turned the engine on, the sudden noise almost made me jump. I drove the long road out of the moors, not looking back once. My eyes were fixed on the mirrors the whole time, checking over and over that no one was following me. When I finally reached a town with houses, lights, and people, my body didn't relax the way I expected. It was like the fear had lodged itself so deep inside that I couldn't shake it. For days after, I kept replaying the night in my head. I tried to think of harmless explanations, but none of them fit. No normal person stands in silence outside a stranger's tent in the middle of the night, touching the fabric and circling it without saying a word. No normal person leaves rope hanging in trees and waits in the dark like that. I didn't report it. I couldn't think of what I would even say. There was no clear crime, no clear threat, just a feeling that something had been terribly wrong. That was enough. I still go hiking sometimes, but I never camp alone anymore. The memory is too sharp, too real. Every time I hear a branch snap behind me, even in daylight, my mind goes back to that night on the moors. I remember the weight of silence, the pressure on the tent wall, the careful footsteps of a man I never saw but will never forget. And the worst part isn't the fear of what he might have done. It's knowing he walked away into the trees, calm and slow, as if he had all the time in the world, as if he wasn't finished, as if he might do the same thing to someone else who thinks they're alone out there. I still remember the first time my dad told me about his old friend, Marcus, and the strange camping trip he went on back in 2014. He never liked talking about it around other people, But one day he opened up to me when we were sitting alone in the garage. I don't know why he chose that moment, but I could tell the story had been stuck in his head for years. When he finished, it stayed with me too. It felt too real, too raw, and too possible. Even now, when I think about forests or camping or the idea of being alone in the dark, I can picture everything he described so clearly that it feels like I was there. Marcus was 32 that year, working long night shifts at a packaging plant outside a small town in Oregon. He was burnt out, always tired, always dealing with stress, and he needed to get away from everything for a few days. He wasn't the kind of person to go to beaches or crowded tourist spots. He preferred quiet places where he could disappear for a weekend and reset his mind. He chose a forested area near the foothills of some mountains, a place he had visited twice before. It wasn't an official campground, but it wasn't illegal to camp there either. It was one of those forgotten pieces of land that only a few locals knew about. He packed light, just a small tent, a sleeping bag, a few cans of food, a tiny camping stove, and a roadside map since he never fully trusted GPS signals in the woods. It was late September, the air cold enough at night to sting the skin but warm enough during the day to hike without freezing. He drove 2 hours up empty roads, losing all signs of civilization as he got deeper into the forest. The kind of place where one wrong turn could leave you lost for hours. But he liked that. He liked the feeling of being cut off, even if it felt a little uncomfortable. By the time he parked near the old logging trail, the light was already fading. He walked almost half an hour into the trees before he found a spot that felt isolated enough. The ground there was uneven, covered in pine needles and damp soil, but he didn't mind. He set up his tent, built a small fire, and cooked a simple meal. For the first night, everything was calm. He said the silence was so thick it felt like a blanket, and the firelight gave him something to focus on while the darkness pressed in from every direction. The second day was peaceful too. He spent hours wandering the area, following animal tracks, checking streams for fish, and taking in the cold, sharp air. The sun dipped fast behind the trees that evening, swallowing the light faster than he expected. He made his second little fire, ate quietly, and crawled into his tent early. This is where things changed. Late into the night, he woke up for no clear reason. His eyes opened, and his body felt stiff from the cold. He lay there in the dark, listening. The forest rarely slept. There was always some kind of sound, but at that moment it felt strangely still. He said it was the silence that scared him first. It wasn't normal. Every insect, every breeze, every rustle seemed to have stopped at the exact same time. He felt something shift in his stomach, that quiet, heavy drop that comes before you realize something isn't right. He pushed himself upright and listened harder. Nothing, not even the faint ringing in the distance that usually came from wind moving through branches. It was like someone had hit a mute switch on the entire world. He tried to calm himself by taking slow breaths, but the silence was so thick it felt like it was pressing against the tent walls. He told himself it was probably just the cold slowing down the usual forest noise. But as he adjusted himself inside the sleeping bag, he felt a soft vibration in the ground. Barely noticeable, almost like the tremble of someone dragging something heavy far away. He wasn't sure what it was at first, so he kept still. Another faint tremor came, slow and uneven. He stayed frozen, leaning slightly forward in the darkness, his heartbeat loud enough to echo inside his ears. The vibration came again, this time closer. It wasn't strong, but it wasn't the kind of movement you could explain away easily. It was the type of disturbance caused by footsteps, not the light kind from animals, but something heavier, something moving with weight. He felt a sharp chill run down his back as he realized the vibrations were in a pattern. Step, pause, step, pause. Slowly, steadily, coming closer from the direction of the trail he had walked earlier that day. He sat there, gripping the edge of his sleeping bag so tightly his knuckles ached. He didn't move, didn't make a single sound. The footsteps got clearer as they entered the area around his camp. He couldn't see anything from where he sat, but he could imagine someone or something standing just outside the tent. Not rushing, not stumbling, just standing there. He said the fear was a strange kind. It wasn't a burst of panic, but a deep, sinking dread that felt like concrete settling in his chest. His tent was thin, too thin. If someone wanted to reach inside, it would take less than a second. Minutes passed. Long, slow minutes where he heard nothing except the faint sound of breathing. Not his own. A steady exhale from somewhere outside. Light but unmistakable. He stayed completely still, holding his breath until his lungs burned. The breathing outside faded, replaced by slow steps circling the tent. The ground trembled just slightly each time. He could tell whoever or whatever it was, they were moving with intention. Not wandering, not lost, checking the area, checking him. He didn't know how long he stayed frozen like that, but eventually the footsteps moved away. Not quickly, not in a panic, but with the same slow rhythm until they faded back into silence. Marcus didn't sleep again that night. He stayed sitting up with his flashlight in his hand, too afraid to unzip the tent and look outside. When dawn came, he finally stepped out. The ground was marked. Someone had walked around his camp area. The footsteps were human, large, deep, and spaced in a way that suggested a tall person. But the part that disturbed him most was the direction they came from. They came from deeper in the forest, not from the trail, not from any road, not from any direction that made sense. He packed everything quickly, barely eating, barely breathing. The forest felt wrong now. Every shadow seemed to watch him. Every branch looked like a hand reaching out. On his way back, he found something he hadn't noticed while arriving. An old, rusted metal sign half buried in the brush. Most of the paint was gone, but he could make out one faded word: restricted. He realized then that he had camped near an area that wasn't meant to be accessed. Whether it was private land, unused government property, or something left behind from old operations, he never figured out. But he knew one thing: someone was still using it. Someone who didn't expect a stranger to show up in the middle of the night. Someone who had walked around his tent while he slept, checking his presence in complete silence. He made it back to his car without looking back. But even as he drove away, he felt watched. Like someone was standing behind the tree line, following him with their eyes until the forest swallowed the road. He never returned to that area again. He never camped alone again either. Every time he tried, he would remember the footsteps, the breathing, the silence, and the fact that whoever came to his tent wasn't an animal or a lost hiker. It was someone who lived in that forgotten space, someone who moved through the woods without a sound, someone who didn't want him there. The part that stays with him the most, what he told my dad years later, is that the footsteps stopped right behind his tent for almost 2 full minutes. Long enough for a person to watch him through the thin fabric. Long enough to decide something. Long enough to let him live or not. He never knew why they left him alone that night, but he never forgot how close he came to finding out what kind of person roamed that quiet, restricted piece of forest. And he never forgot that the silence he heard wasn't natural. It was the silence of someone else listening for him. That was the ending of his story, and it was clear enough. He survived because whoever was out there chose to walk away. And that was the only reason he ever got to tell anyone what happened. I had been wanting a quiet break for months, so in late September of 2019 I finally took a week off and drove into a remote part of Western Austria. Near the edge of a valley, people didn't talk about much. Most tourists stayed close to the towns, the lakes, the easy trails. I wanted a place where I could walk for hours without meeting anyone. Somewhere far from phone signals, paved roads, or the noise of people. I packed light gear, simple food, a small tent, and enough water to last 2 days, planning to refill from streams once I got deeper into the area. The air felt colder than I expected when I stepped out of the car, and the wind carried that early autumn smell of wet leaves and cooling soil. I tightened my jacket, checked my backpack straps one more time, and started walking along a narrow dirt path that wound uphill between tall pines. The trees seemed older here, thicker and darker than the ones near the highways, and after only 10 minutes the road disappeared behind me like it had never existed. I spent the first hour enjoying the quiet. Every step made a soft crunch on the needles covering the ground. Occasionally I would hear a bird or the distant snap of a branch deeper in the forest. Nothing unusual. I kept a steady pace until the terrain began to rise sharply. By noon I was sweating under my clothes, but the cold air dried it quickly. The valley opened slightly at one point, and I could see a line of low mountains across the distance, their tops hidden by a thin layer of cloud. That quiet view made me feel like I was alone in the world, in a good way. By late afternoon, I reached the place I had chosen on the map a week earlier. It was a flat patch of ground near a stream that flowed slow and clear. There were rocks along one side that looked like they had been pushed up long ago by some old landslide. I set my pack down and took a slow breath, enjoying how clean the air smelled. Setting up the tent took only a few minutes. I put it close to the stream, but far enough that the ground felt firm. My boots were covered in dust, so I sat on a rock to clean them, watching the sunlight sink behind the trees. Everything looked normal. There was no strange sound, no uneasy feeling, just a quiet forest cooling down for the night. Around an hour later, as the sky turned darker, I started to feel a subtle heaviness in the air. At first I thought it was just the drop in temperature, but it felt more like the forest itself was getting still in a way that didn't match the time of day. The stream kept flowing, but everything else became quiet. No birds, no rustling, no small animal movements. I ignored it. Most people would say forests get silent at night anyway. I made a small meal, ate slowly, and put everything away before it got completely dark. When I finally climbed into the tent, the first thing I noticed was how loud my heartbeat sounded. I tried to calm myself by breathing deeply. Nothing was wrong. I told myself that. I had camped alone many times before, but something about that place felt different, as if the entire forest was paying attention to me. I tried to sleep early, but the moment I closed my eyes, I felt the kind of alertness that comes when the body senses something before the mind does. I lay perfectly still, listening. For a long time, there was nothing. Not wind, not insects, not even the distant cracking of wood. Just complete stillness. Around midnight, the sound finally came. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was a slow, deliberate crunch of weight on dry needles. Far off but clear enough that I knew it wasn't a small animal. It had a rhythm to it, slow and careful, like someone trying not to be heard. My body tensed without me telling it to. The steps stopped, then started again, slightly closer. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe deeply. My tent fabric felt paper thin. Another step, then another, each one spaced out with long pauses. I tried to tell myself it could be a deer, but I had heard deer move before. They were lighter, quicker, more nervous in sound. This was something heavier, steadier, something that placed its weight down with purpose. When the steps stopped again, they seemed close enough that I thought I could reach out and touch whatever was making them. But I kept my arms locked beside me. I stared upward at the dark fabric of the tent, trying to control the shaking in my hands. Minutes passed, or maybe it was longer. My mind was racing, but my body refused to move. I didn't dare unzip the tent or make a sound. The forest was too quiet, and anything I did felt like it would echo endlessly. Then, just as slowly as it had started, the sound drifted away. Each step grew softer, more distant, until the forest returned to the same dead silence as before. I stayed awake the rest of the night, blinking at the dim shape of the tent roof, counting each breath. When morning came, the sunlight made the tent glow pale yellow. I waited until the forest felt normal again. Birds chirping, small rustling sounds, the stream moving confidently. Only then did I unzip the tent and step outside. First, nothing looked unusual, but when I walked along the line of trees behind the tent, I saw the prints in the soft dirt, large, deep impressions spaced in a slow pattern. Not boots, not shoes, bare feet, human-sized, maybe larger, pressed deep enough that they were left clean and clear in the cold earth. The tracks came from the forest, passed near the tent, then continued toward the stream and disappeared into the rocks on the other side. I stared at them longer than I should have. My skin crawled when I imagined someone walking barefoot at night through that freezing forest. It made no sense. No one traveled barefoot out there, and the direction the tracks came from was so deep in the woods that even the nearest village was hours away. I felt a strong urge to pack up and leave immediately, but I forced myself to move slowly, carefully. I didn't want to look panicked. I didn't know if the person, or whatever it was still nearby. I kept my eyes on the tree line while taking down the tent, listening again for any unusual sound. Everything sounded normal, which somehow made it more disturbing, like the forest was pretending nothing had happened. I filled my water bottle, checked my gear twice, and started walking back down the trail. The path that had felt peaceful the day before now felt narrow and dark. Every bend made my stomach tighten, because I couldn't see what might be waiting beyond it. Several times I thought I heard something behind me. Soft steps, faint breathing. But every time I turned around, the trail was empty. It took me less than half the time to get back to the car. When I finally saw it through the trees, relief washed through me so quickly that I almost dropped my pack. I opened the door, threw everything inside, and sat there with my hands gripping the steering wheel until they stopped shaking. As I drove away, I looked into the rearview mirror again and again. The forest stayed still and quiet behind me, not giving away anything about what had happened in the night. But the image of those footprints stayed in my mind, clearer than anything else. I never went back to that part of Austria. I never even tried to figure out who or what walked past my tent that night. I didn't want answers. Some things don't need explanations. Sometimes the most frightening part of an experience is knowing it was real and choosing not to look any deeper into it. The only thing I took from that trip was the understanding that even the quietest places hold secrets. And sometimes those secrets walk right past you in the dark, slow enough for you to hear every step, but careful enough that you never see their face. I still camp, but never alone, and never that deep into the wild again. That one night taught me to respect silence in a way I never had before, because now I know that silence isn't always empty. Sometimes it's just waiting. I was 27 when I decided to spend a weekend alone in the mountains of northern Spain in late October of 2019. I had been working long hours that month and thought a short camping trip might help me breathe a bit. I chose a quiet, less popular area near the Cantabrian Range, a place where most people only came in summer. By late autumn, it was usually empty, wet, and cold, but I liked that. I liked being away from everything and everyone for a while. The trip started normally. I drove up a narrow, cracked road that wound between dark pine trees and wet rock walls. The sky had been gray since morning, but the weather forecast only said light showers, so I didn't expect much trouble. I parked near a small dirt clearing and followed a trail deeper into the woods. The ground felt damp under my boots. The air had a heavy, earthy smell. I remember thinking it felt like a place where time moved slower. I set up my tent near a slope beside a shallow stream. The water made a soft, steady sound as it slid over stones, and at first that sound made me relax. I built a small fire, cooked a simple meal, and spent the late afternoon reading, listening to the wind push through the branches. There was nothing scary, nothing strange, nothing even unusual. Everything was calm. Then the rain started. At first, it was just a light tapping on the leaves above me, the kind of rain that feels harmless. But soon the drops grew harder and more steady, and the wind picked up a bit. I put out the fire before it got drowned and crawled into my tent. The air got colder fast. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the rain hit the fabric like fingers drumming constantly. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt sharp, restless, almost aggressive. By nightfall, the rain turned into a full storm. The wind pushed against the tent walls in hard bursts. Water slid down the sides in streams. Every few minutes, I felt the ground shift slightly under my sleeping pad as the soil soaked through. I kept checking the corners of the tent to make sure nothing was leaking. For the first hour or two, I tried to ignore how uneasy I felt. But something in the air seemed different. Not supernatural, just wrong. It was around 10 p.m. when I first heard it. Over the pounding of the rain, I caught a faint, uneven noise, a kind of scraping. Not metal, not wood, but something rough dragging over something else. It came from somewhere uphill, somewhere beyond the slope. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just a tree branch moving in the wind, but the noise didn't match the rhythm of the storm. It came in slow, irregular bursts. Scrape, pause, scrape again, longer pause, then silence. I lay there completely still, trying to pick apart the sounds of the rain so I could hear better. The storm made everything louder, but the scraping came again, a bit clearer this time. It was closer, a slow, dragging weight sliding over wet ground. My chest tightened a little. My breathing slowed without me trying. My stomach felt heavier, like I had swallowed a stone. I didn't move. I didn't even sit up. I only listened. The sound stopped for a long moment, long enough for me to start thinking it was nothing, just my mind exaggerating natural noises. Maybe a fallen tree trunk shifting in the mud. Maybe rocks rolling from the slope because the rain loosened them. But right when I almost convinced myself, I heard something else. Soft, muffled steps. Not animal steps. They were too heavy, too slow, too deliberate. Someone was out there. I held my breath, trying to track the direction. The steps came from the left side of the tent, somewhere between the trees. They weren't coming fast. They were careful, like whoever it was didn't want to be heard, but the wet ground made it impossible to stay silent. I felt my throat tighten. I felt a cold sweat forming even though the air was freezing. I kept thinking, who would even be out here in this weather? It made no sense. The area was usually empty, especially during storms. And even if someone did end up here, why were they walking so slowly and deliberately around my campsite? Why at night? Why in the rain? The steps stopped again. All I could hear was the storm beating the tent. I didn't move a single muscle. My sleeping bag felt like a trap instead of comfort. My flashlight was within reach, but I didn't grab it yet. I didn't want to draw attention. A few minutes passed. The storm got louder. Then I heard a new sound, something soft hitting the ground near the tent. A faint thud, like a small rock being dropped. Then another, then a slightly larger one. It didn't sound like random falling debris. It sounded placed. I felt something icy slide through my stomach. Someone was throwing small stones near my tent. Slowly, gently, like they were testing something. Maybe testing if I was awake. The rain muffled everything, but I could still hear each small thud, one after another. Not many, just a few, and then it stopped again. I finally reached for my flashlight and held it tight in my hand. I didn't turn it on. I just gripped it so hard my fingers started to ache. I stayed that way for a long time, trying to hear anything else. Eventually the storm shifted, the wind changed direction, and the scraping sound returned, but this time it was farther away, moving slowly downhill. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every minute felt like an hour. Every shift of the rain sounded like footsteps. Every gust of wind sounded like someone breathing. I stayed in the same position until dawn, barely blinking. When the first bit of pale gray light filtered through the tent, I finally worked up enough courage to unzip it. The air was ice cold. The rain had stopped, but everything looked washed out and soaked. The first thing I noticed was the mud. There were footprints, not boot prints like mine. These were flatter, wider, less defined, like someone wearing worn-out shoes or something without a firm sole. They were fresh, softened by rain, but still clear enough to follow. They came from the trees, circled around my tent in a slow, uneven path, and then stopped near the back of it. That's where I found the stones. 5 of them, small, smooth, placed in a half-circle formation. Not thrown randomly, placed, arranged neatly, like someone quietly crouched there in the rain doing it with steady hands. I felt a cold rush down my back. I looked uphill where the scraping sound had come from. The slope was covered in deep drag marks, like something heavy had been pulled down during the storm. They weren't natural. They were too straight, too intentional. I didn't waste time. I packed everything in minutes, throwing things into my backpack without caring about order. My hands shook the whole time. The silence of the morning felt worse than the noise of the night. I could feel the place watching me, even though I didn't see anyone. When I finally reached my car and locked the doors, I just sat there for a long moment, staring through the windshield at the wet trees. My heart was still beating too fast. I kept thinking about the stones, the footsteps, the dragging sound. Someone had been close to my tent for hours, maybe watching, maybe waiting, maybe just passing by. I had no idea. But the way the stones were placed made it clear they were not lost, confused, or wandering. They were purposeful. When I drove down the mountain, I didn't look in the rearview mirror more than once. I didn't want to know if anything was behind me. I never went back to that area again. And I never camped alone after that. The ending was simple, but clear. Nothing supernatural happened.
No Ghost, no Creature, no Fairy Tale.
Just a real person in the dark woods during a storm, moving slowly, placing things quietly, and staying too close to me for far too long. That was enough to change how I see the silence of the forest forever. Even years later, whenever it rains at night, I still hear that slow scraping sound somewhere in the back of my mind. And I still wonder what would have happened if I had stepped outside the tent that night instead of staying still. I'm glad I never found out. I went camping alone in the south of France in the summer of 2019, a few months after I turned 25. I had been working long hours for almost a year without a break, and I wanted a simple trip where I could stay close to nature, far from noise, people, and the stress of my job. I chose a quiet forest area near a small village called Valmont, not a famous tourist place, which was exactly what I wanted. The forest there was old, the trees tall and thick, and the ground covered with soft moss that stayed cool even in warm weather. I planned to stay 2 nights, hike around, take photos, and just let my mind slow down. I arrived in the late afternoon, parked my small rental car near a dirt trail, and walked deeper into the trees. The air smelled fresh, almost sweet, like pine and warm earth. There was a small river close by that I could hear running before I even saw it. When I reached the open patch of ground where I planned to camp, I felt good. The sunlight was still strong, the sky clear, and I didn't see anyone around. It felt like the perfect quiet spot. I set up my tent, then walked around to look for dry firewood. As I gathered sticks, I noticed the forest felt unusually still. I didn't hear birds, which was strange for that area. I told myself it could just be the time of day or the heat. It didn't bother me much then. After building a small fire and eating a simple meal, I watched the sun drop slowly behind the trees. The sky changed from bright gold to a deep blue that looked almost too soft to be real. When night came, the forest turned darker than I expected. The moon was blocked by thick branches, and the fire gave off only a small circle of light. I stayed close to it, listening to the crackling of the wood and letting the warm air settle around me. I felt comfortable enough, even if the silence felt heavier than before. I tried to relax, telling myself this was exactly why I came, to escape everything. But around midnight, I heard something. It was faint, something like footsteps, but softer. At first, I thought it was an animal, fox, maybe a deer. I didn't feel scared, but the sound came again, this time more controlled, almost slow, like someone was placing each step carefully. The sound stopped, then started again after a few seconds. I couldn't see anything past the firelight, so I sat still and tried to listen. The forest had gone completely silent again. No wind, no insects, nothing. The quiet made the sound clearer when it returned. I felt a cold wave move down my back. I turned off the small lantern I had beside me so my eyes could adjust. I waited quietly, trying to calm myself. I didn't want to overreact. It was a forest after all, not some dangerous place. I kept trying to tell myself that. The steps grew faint again and disappeared. After a few minutes of silence, I convinced myself an animal had just wandered near the camp. I tried to sleep. I didn't rest long. I woke to the feeling that something was not right. I didn't know why at first, but when I opened my eyes, I noticed the fire had almost died. The forest around me was pitch black. I reached for my lantern, turned it on, and sat up. My chest felt tight. I scanned the area, the light from the lantern cutting through the darkness just enough to show the edge of my camp. That's when I saw him. A man, standing just inside the trees, facing my direction. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He didn't seem surprised or confused. He just stood there like he had been watching me for a long time. His clothes looked dirty, old, like he had been living outdoors for weeks. His face was partly covered by shadows, but I could make out a long beard and dull eyes that didn't look away. He wasn't close enough to touch me, but close enough that one quick step would bring him into the camp. My hands shook as my body started to react before I even processed the situation. The lantern light flickered slightly, making the shadows around him shift. I froze. I had no idea how long he had been there. Had he been the one walking around earlier? Was he watching me while I slept? The thought made my stomach tighten. I grabbed my pack slowly, trying not to alert him, but he stayed still. Not a single movement. I realized I needed to leave right away. Staying even one more minute in the dark with a stranger watching me felt dangerous. My car was 20 minutes away through the trees, not a long walk during the day, but at night it felt like the path could swallow me if I made one wrong move. I didn't pack everything. I didn't even try. I only took the lantern, my phone, and a small knife I carried for cutting rope and food. I slowly backed away, never letting the light leave the man's direction. He didn't move, not even a twitch. His stillness felt unnatural, but not in a supernatural way. More like he was planning something or waiting for a chance to act. When I got far enough, I turned fast and started walking through the trees. The darkness was thick, and my heart was pounding. I kept turning back, flashing the light behind me to see if he was following. For the first few minutes, I didn't see anything. Then I caught sight of movement behind the trees. Not fast, not running, but steady, like he was walking the same path I was. I pushed myself harder, almost running, trying to stay quiet. My legs felt weak, and the uneven ground made it hard not to trip. Every time I turned the lantern back, I saw nothing but trees, but I knew he wasn't far. I could feel it. The last stretch toward the car felt endless. I recognized the old fallen tree near the path and knew I was close. The air felt colder, and my breathing was sharp and loud. When I finally reached the small dirt clearing where my car was parked, I almost cried from relief, but the fear didn't leave. My hands shook so much that I dropped the keys twice before unlocking the door. Before getting inside, I looked back one more time. There he was, standing at the tree line the same way he had been near my camp, still silent, watching. The lantern light reached his face this time, and I saw how empty his expression was. His eyes didn't look angry or scared. They looked blank, like he wasn't fully there. That frightened me even more. I got into the car, locked the doors, and started the engine so quickly the tires kicked dirt behind me. I drove straight to the village without stopping. When I reached the small guest house where I had planned to check out the next day, I parked right in front and sat in the car for a few minutes trying to steady my breathing. I didn't sleep that night. The image of the man standing in the forest stayed with me for hours. The next morning, after the sun came up, I returned with 2 local guards. They checked the forest, walked all the way to my campsite, and even farther. They didn't find anyone. They told me the area sometimes had travelers, hikers, or people living off the land, but no one had reported anything strange recently. My tent was still there, untouched. My things were scattered exactly as I had left them, but I knew what I saw. I didn't stay another night. I packed everything and drove back to the city. Even now, years later, I still think about that moment when I woke up and saw him standing at the edge of my camp. The stillness, the blank expression, the quiet steps in the dark. It all felt too real to forget. The ending to the story is simple but clear. I survived, but the fear stayed with me. It made me understand how vulnerable I was that night, alone in a foreign forest with no one around. I never went camping alone again after that. Not because of ghosts or myths or anything like that, but because of one silent man standing in the dark, watching me with empty eyes. That was more than enough to change the way I travel forever. It was the summer of 2013, deep in the rugged mountains of eastern Afghanistan, when I found myself on what was supposed to be a routine reconnaissance mission. I was 25 at the time, a squad leader in the 3rd Infantry, and my team had been tasked with observing a remote valley for enemy movement. The mountains were unforgiving, jagged peaks slicing the sky, and the heat during the day was brutal, but the nights brought a cold so sharp it burned through your clothes. We were supposed to camp for a couple of nights to gather intel and then pull back before dawn. But things rarely went according to plan out there. Our convoy had dropped us off late in the afternoon. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the rocky terrain. The valley we were assigned to monitor was narrow, flanked by cliffs that rose almost vertically, and the only way in or out was a narrow, winding trail barely wide enough for a mule. We set up our temporary camp on a ledge that gave us a clear view of the valley floor. I made sure every tent was secured with extra stakes. The wind could howl down the mountains and sweep someone off if they weren't careful. We checked our weapons, counted our ammo, and I made the rounds, making sure each of my 4 men was in place and ready. The first night was quiet, almost unnervingly so. I could hear the distant wind wailing through the rocks, carrying a metallic scent of iron and dust. It was so still that even a small movement in the bushes below could be heard. I lay on my cot, trying to rest, but my mind wouldn't let me. Every rustle made me tense. Every shadow seemed like it could be someone watching us. Around 2 in the morning, I noticed something off. The pattern of the stars in the sky had shifted slightly. It was subtle, but instinctively I knew it meant a storm was brewing. Not just rain, this area had sudden flash floods. And floods in a narrow valley like that could be lethal. By dawn, the storm had arrived in full force. The rain pounded the ledge, turning the dirt into thick mud, washing away some of our makeshift paths. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. We couldn't use the radios because the storm interfered with the signal, and moving was nearly impossible. We huddled in our tents, but even inside the thin fabric, the cold seeped in. The constant patter of rain was hypnotic, almost drowning out the occasional distant crack of what could have been falling rocks. I knew we had to maintain surveillance, but leaving the tents felt suicidal. It was during that night that things started to feel wrong. I noticed tracks in the mud around our camp, large, irregular prints that weren't ours. They circled the tents, coming close enough that I could swear I could see the outlines of boots, but there were no humans in sight. My heart sank. The valley had been quiet for weeks, according to intel. Whoever or whatever made these tracks wasn't supposed to be there. I checked my weapon again, tightened my grip, and tried to rationalize it. Maybe local shepherds, maybe animals, but the size, the depth, and the way the prints moved around the camp as if checking us out, it didn't feel natural. By the second night, the storm had lessened but left the trails slick and dangerous. I decided to do a solo sweep down the narrow trail, carrying only my rifle and a flashlight. The others were on watch, tense but trusting me. I moved slowly, every step calculated. The further down the trail I went, the more evident it became that we weren't alone. Bits of equipment caught in the underbrush, scraps of what looked like fabric from military fatigues, even a small bundle of supplies that had clearly been dropped deliberately or accidentally. It was as if someone had been here recently, maybe even watching us for hours. My skin crawled, but I kept moving. Then I heard it. A faint click, almost like a camera shutter or a mechanical device. My head snapped up, shining my flashlight toward the sound, but the storm's aftermath had made visibility poor, and the light reflected off the wet rocks, making it impossible to distinguish shapes. I froze, listening. Nothing moved. I counted my breaths. Slowly, I turned and walked back, doubling my pace without running. By the time I reached the camp, my team was alert, guns ready. I explained the sounds and the tracks. Their eyes widened. "You saw them too?" one of them asked, though we spoke in whispers. It was clear we were all feeling the same cold, crawling dread. We decided to stay put, fortifying the camp as best as we could. The valley's narrow walls meant we couldn't retreat quickly without exposing ourselves. So we hunkered down and waited for extraction the next day. Sleep was impossible. The tension was unbearable. Every rustle in the underbrush, every shadow in the moonlight, made our hearts jump. I kept my rifle beside me at all times, finger resting lightly on the trigger. The final night was the worst. Around midnight, I heard movement just below our ledge. I crawled to the edge and looked through binoculars. My stomach dropped. There were figures moving in the mud, carrying backpacks and what looked like weapons. They weren't Taliban, at least not the regular fighters we knew. Their movements were calculated, almost military in discipline, but they avoided making any direct noise. They were closing in on our camp, probing, testing. I realized we had been watched since the day we arrived. The valley had been mapped, studied, and our every move tracked. Whoever they were, they weren't here to negotiate. I had to make a decision. Staying put meant certain confrontation in a few hours, with the advantage firmly in their hands. I gathered the team, whispered the plan, and we moved silently down a secondary trail I had noticed during the daylight. The mud made it treacherous. One wrong step could mean sliding down the cliff into the raging river below. The rain had carved new paths, but I followed them, leading the team like a shadow through the dark. Every step was a gamble, every sound amplified. By the first light of morning, we had reached a small outcropping with radio reception. I called in our coordinates and requested immediate extraction. The helicopter arrived within the hour, slicing through the mist like a phantom. We climbed aboard, wet, exhausted, and silent, but alive. Looking back at the valley as we lifted off, I could see the figures still moving in the mud, their presence lingering like a shadow over the land. The experience stayed with me. Months later, after debriefings and reports, I learned that the valley had been used by an unknown armed group, possibly mercenaries or rogue operatives who had evaded detection for months. No direct confrontation had occurred, but they had been ready, patient, and methodical. We had survived not by force, but by caution, observation, and luck. Back on base, I couldn't shake the image of the muddy prints circling our tents, the faint mechanical clicks in the night, and the disciplined shadows moving silently in the storm. I realized that in war, fear isn't always about bullets or explosions. Sometimes, it's about the waiting, the uncertainty, and the knowledge that something capable, intelligent, and dangerous is watching you, just out of reach. In the end, the mission was technically a success. We gathered intel without a firefight, but the memory of those nights in the storm, of the valley and its unseen watchers, stayed with me. Every time I camped in training exercises afterward, the images returned. The slick mud, the cold wind cutting through my clothes, and the sense of being seen when I was sure I was alone. I learned that fear, when real and unrelenting, isn't something you escape. It's something you endure, survive, and carry with you. I never thought a simple research trip would turn into something that would haunt my memory for the rest of my life. It was 2018, I was 27, freshly graduated with a PhD in epidemiology, and I had been granted funding for a small project studying zoonotic diseases in the remote forests of Slovenia. The aim was to collect samples from wild animals, soil, and water sources, mapping any unusual bacteria or viruses. I was meticulous, organized, and confident. I thought I could handle anything the forest threw at me. I was wrong. I arrived in Slovenia in late September. The air was crisp, carrying a faint smell of damp leaves and moss. I rented a small cabin in the edge of Triglav National Park as my base. My plan was to camp for a few days in the deeper parts of the forest to collect soil and water samples, track animal footprints, and record environmental data. I had all my equipment: portable lab kit, sterilized containers, field microscope, GPS tracker, emergency beacon, and a fully charged satellite phone. I even had extra batteries, rainproof notebooks, and protective gear. I felt prepared. The first 2 days in the forest were peaceful. I hiked long trails, cataloged small mammals, collected water from streams, and swabbed soil from under rocks and fallen logs. I noted everything in my journals meticulously: the temperature, the humidity, the soil pH, the animal tracks. Each night, I slept in a small tent I had pitched near a clearing. I made a small fire for warmth and boiled water for drinking. The forest was silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves, the distant call of a fox, and the soft patter of rain. It was beautiful, but a strange feeling lingered, like the forest was observing me. I brushed it off. On the third day, I decided to move deeper into the forest. The GPS showed a small clearing near a stream that hadn't been sampled. The path was overgrown, the underbrush thick, and the terrain uneven. I noticed old tracks, big, human-like footprints, but irregular. They were faint, almost as if whoever had made them was careful not to leave traces. But I didn't think much of it. By late afternoon, I reached the clearing. I started taking samples from the stream, testing pH levels, and setting up small traps for small mammals. That's when I noticed it, the smell. A sharp, metallic odor, like iron mixed with decay. I scanned the area. There was nothing visible at first, but the smell was overpowering. I traced it to a shallow ditch partially hidden by ferns. Inside, half buried under leaves, was a small, decayed animal carcass. It looked recent. I documented it, collected a swab for my research, and moved on. As evening fell, the forest grew colder and denser. Shadows stretched unnaturally, and the wind carried strange, almost rhythmic noises, like something heavy moving across dry leaves. I set up my tent in the clearing closer to the stream. I double-checked my supplies, boiled water, and secured the tent flaps. I told myself it was just the forest, my imagination, the isolation messing with my senses. That night, I woke up drenched in sweat. I had heard something, faint, deliberate footsteps circling my tent. My heart raced, and I stayed perfectly still, listening. The sound stopped, then moved away. I rationalized it. Deer, foxes, or some other forest animal. I was too tired to do more than shiver and hope the sound hadn't been human. The next morning, I found fresh footprints around my tent. Large, muddy, not human, but not exactly animal either. I examined them carefully. The toes were elongated, slightly curved, and the stride was too wide for a normal human. My rational mind screamed wildlife, but a part of me whispered that something wasn't right. Still, I pressed on. I needed these samples for my research. That day, while collecting water samples upstream, I noticed something strange in the water. The stream's current was slow, but there was a strange reddish sediment swirling in a small pool. I knelt to test it, and my gloves brushed against something soft. I looked closer and froze. There, half submerged in the muddy water, was a human hand. Pale, bloated, fingernails darkened. I stumbled back, heart pounding, stomach twisting. I knew I had to stay calm. I recorded the coordinates, took photographs, and carefully avoided touching anything. My first instinct was to leave immediately and report it, but the area was deep in the forest, far from roads. My GPS had no signal, and my satellite phone was showing low battery. Panic rose in my chest, but I forced myself to plan. By afternoon, I decided to hike back to a safer area near the main trail. The forest seemed different now, heavier, almost suffocating. Branches scraped against my tent bag as if they were reaching for me, and the rhythmic noises I had heard before returned, louder, more deliberate. I kept looking behind me, expecting to see someone, anyone, but there was only darkness between the trees. When I finally emerged near a secondary trail, I noticed a small clearing that seemed untouched until I saw the tent. Another tent, identical to mine in size and color, standing perfectly pitched, no sign of anyone around. My blood ran cold. I approached cautiously. Inside, I saw traces of belongings. A backpack, a journal, half a sandwich. It looked like someone had been here recently, maybe watching me. The rational part of my mind said, "Stay calm. This could be a fellow researcher." But the instinctive part screamed danger. I decided not to stay. I packed my equipment quickly and headed toward the main path. The forest seemed to respond. Branches snapped behind me, distant footsteps echoed, and the metallic smell from before returned, stronger this time. I realized it wasn't just an animal. I wasn't alone, and whoever or whatever was moving silently, watching me, calculating my path. Hours later, exhausted, bleeding from scratches and covered in mud, I reached a ranger station at the edge of the forest. The rangers were shocked when I showed them the GPS coordinates and photographs. They organized a search team immediately. Later, they told me that the area I had been in was known for illegal activities, poaching, and occasionally criminal camps. The human-like footprints weren't animal at all. The half-buried carcasses and traces were evidence of poachers hiding stolen wildlife, and the hand I found had been from a recent, unrelated accident in the forest. The rangers thanked me for documenting it, but warned me never to go that deep again without proper support. Even now, years later, I can't shake the memory. The cold, wet forest, the heavy silence that wasn't silence, the feeling of being observed by something calculating. I completed my research, but the thrill and pride I felt were forever tainted by the fear I experienced. I realized that knowledge has a price, and sometimes curiosity can lead you straight into danger. I never camped alone in the forest again. I always make sure someone knows exactly where I am, and I triple-check every piece of equipment. I still work in medical research, but I stick to labs now. The forest taught me a lesson about respect, preparation, and fear. A lesson I will never forget. It was the summer of 2018, and I had just turned 24. I decided to take a solo camping trip in the forests near Lake Superior, Michigan. I wanted something different from the usual weekend hikes and cabin stays. Something raw, away from roads, away from cell signals, away from people. I was looking for solitude and maybe a bit of challenge. I had planned the trip for months, studying maps, learning about the wildlife, making a gear checklist. My plan was to hike into a remote area, set up camp near the water, fish, and spend 3 days alone. I started my hike in the morning, carrying a backpack that was probably heavier than it should have been, filled with a small tent, sleeping bag, stove, extra food, water, and emergency gear. The forest was thick, dense with pine and birch, and the trail quickly narrowed as I went deeper. The air smelled clean and earthy, and there was a distant hum of insects. Birds sang high above, and I could hear woodpeckers hammering on trees. The kind of sounds that make you feel both alive and alone. By mid-afternoon, I reached a clearing by a narrow stream that fed into Lake Superior. It was perfect. Flat ground, access to water, some natural cover from the trees, and far enough from the main trail that I wouldn't be disturbed. I unpacked my gear, set up my tent, and collected firewood. The sun was still high, but the forest had shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally long. I cooked a simple meal of canned beans and rice over the portable stove. The quiet around me was almost unnatural, and as I ate, I started noticing small things. The distant snap of a branch that sounded too deliberate to be an animal, the occasional rustle in the underbrush that stopped as soon as I looked in that direction. At first, I told myself it was paranoia, that my brain was just amplifying the usual sounds of a forest. But as the day wore on, the feeling didn't fade. It grew. After dinner, I walked down to the stream to refill my water bottle. That's when I noticed footprints. Large, deep impressions in the mud, leading from the far side of the clearing to the edge of the stream. They weren't human, not entirely. I've hiked a lot and I recognized most animal tracks, deer, raccoon, even bear, but these were different. Bigger than a bear paw with what looked like claws, and they weren't spaced like a bear walking on all fours. My heart started racing. I double-checked my campsite, making sure my tent was zipped, my backpack was close, my knife was within reach. The sun was starting to drop, and shadows lengthened even faster than I thought possible. The forest was suddenly colder than before, and a fog began creeping along the ground near the stream, thickening the air. I started my small campfire and sat close, trying to convince myself to relax. Night fell, and with it came silence. Not the peaceful silence you imagine when you go camping, but a heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to swallow every sound. Even the insects and birds had disappeared. I stayed up by the fire for hours, staring at the flames, occasionally glancing toward the edge of the clearing. Every rustle, every snap of a twig made me flinch. I thought about packing up and hiking back out, but it was dark, and I didn't want to get lost. Around midnight, I heard it, the first clear sign that I wasn't alone. A deep, low growl coming from the trees at the far end of the clearing. Not a dog, not a wolf. It sounded intelligent, like something was assessing me. My pulse shot through the roof. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the sound. Nothing, just trees swaying slightly in the wind, shadows shifting in ways that made my stomach churn. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a large predator, maybe a bear. Bears weren't typically aggressive at this time of year unless provoked. But these sounds were deliberate, constant. I kept my fire going, added more wood, and tried to stay awake. I didn't want to sleep, didn't want to be unprepared if whatever it was decided to come closer. Hours passed. The sounds continued, circling my campsite but never coming fully into view. I stayed as still as possible, keeping my breathing slow, waiting for sunrise. At some point, I realized the creature wasn't just around my campsite. It was following the stream, moving silently, carefully, as though it knew I was there but didn't want to reveal itself yet. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed. I packed my gear in record time, careful not to make noise. I left the clearing as quickly as possible, moving downstream along the trail I had scouted earlier. Every step, every crack of a branch under my boot felt amplified. My eyes kept darting into the woods, half expecting to see a massive shape watching me. I made it back to my car by late morning. Relief hit me like a physical force when I saw the familiar vehicle. I checked my surroundings one last time before driving off. There was no sign of tracks beyond the clearing. Whatever had been following me didn't pursue me to the road. Later, I went back with a wildlife expert to examine the area. He admitted he had no explanation for the tracks. Larger than any known predator in the region, claws shaped differently than bear or wolf, stride too long for a known animal. It left a lingering sense of unease. I didn't return to that forest for a long time, and when I finally did, I made sure to camp in established sites with other people around. That trip taught me something important. The forest is beautiful, but it is also unpredictable. There are things out there that we don't see often, that we don't understand. It doesn't need to be supernatural to be terrifying. It's the quiet intelligence in the unknown, the careful patience of a creature you can't see, that makes it frightening. Looking back, I realized how unprepared I was, not just physically but mentally. I had underestimated how much being truly alone in a vast, wild place can affect your mind. The relief of leaving the forest wasn't just about safety. It was about reclaiming normalcy, returning to a world where I understood the threats. Even now, I can picture that clearing, the stream, the fog creeping along the ground, and I can feel the tension, the weight of being watched. But I also remember the sunrise, the way the first light felt almost holy after hours of fear, the overwhelming sense of relief when I finally stepped onto the dirt road leading out. That ending, getting back to the road and then home, was as clear as it could be. I survived, and I survived because I respected the unknown, stayed calm when I could, and never underestimated the forest again. It wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't a ghost story. It was real. And that reality, the sheer unpredictability of the wild, is enough to make the blood run cold if you're not careful.